A man who had everything, yet no one to share it with. Inside a vast, silent mansion, Edward Martin, a 46-year-old successful businessman, sat alone in the living room. In front of him lay a surrogacy contract. No love, no attachment, just a transaction. "I don't believe in love anymore," his voice echoed in his mind, a confession he'd never dare say aloud. "I just need a child, to know I left something behind in this world." Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The city had gone quiet for the night. Only the hum of passing traffic and the distant wail of sirens reminded the world it was still awake. Edward Martin sat behind the wheel of his midnight black Mercedes, stopped at a red light in the heart of downtown. He wasn't in a hurry, not tonight. His meetings were done, his schedule empty. But the weight on his chest hadn't lifted. Success hadn't cured that. He glanced to the right. On the sidewalk, barely lit by a flickering street lamp, sat a young woman. Thin, wrapped in a worn coat with knees tucked under her chin, she hunched over a torn sketchpad balanced on her lap. Her pencil moved quickly, deliberately, focused, as if nothing else existed. Edward might have driven off. Normally he would have. But something about her, maybe the way she blocked out the world with nothing but graphite and paper, stopped him. Sophie Bennett didn't notice him at first. She was used to being invisible. Just another figure on the street, easily ignored. Her hands, though chilled, moved with a quiet rhythm. Her eyes, bright but tired, held on to the image she was capturing, the shadow of a nearby lamppost dancing across the cracked pavement. The light turned green. Edward didn't move. He watched her. Not with judgment or pity, but with something else. Something he didn't quite understand. Curiosity? Recognition? A shared silence, perhaps? Sophie finally looked up, sensing the weight of his gaze. Their eyes met for the first time. His, guarded and calculating. Hers, wary yet unflinching. No words passed between them. None were needed. It wasn't a dramatic encounter. No bold gestures. No saving or being saved. Just a quiet moment between two souls, each broken in their own way, each wrapped in loneliness they wore like armor. Edward drove away Dot. But he didn't forget her. And that, for a man like Edward, was unusual. Very unusual. The next evening, Sophie found herself sitting in a quiet cafe, not by choice, but because Edward Martin had asked her to meet him again. He had offered her dinner, warm coffee, and now, something else, something unexpected. Outside, the winter wind scraped against the windows and the world felt miles away. Inside, between them, was a quiet tension. Not hostile, just fragile. Edward sat with perfect posture, fingers folded loosely, expression unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who made small talk. When he spoke, it was deliberate, like every word had been drafted in advance. "I need a child, Sophie. But not a wife, not a relationship, just a child." His tone was calm, too calm, as if he were discussing a business transaction, not the beginning of a human life. Sophie blinked slowly, trying to absorb what she'd just heard. She didn't respond right away. Her hand tightened around the chipped ceramic mug in front of her. Half coffee, half silence. Edward continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "You would carry the child. You'd be cared for. Medically, financially, in every way. But after the birth, we part ways. No strings, no custody disputes, just closure." He slid a folder across the table. It landed softly near her hand. Legal documents, she assumed. Clean, cold, binding. Sophie looked down at the folder but didn't touch it. Her stomach churned, not with fear but something deeper. A quiet shame. And then, anger. Not at Edward, but at life. At the world that had pushed her to this corner. She didn't say yes. Not yet. She simply stood, gave him a long look, and walked out into the cold night. That night, Sophie sat beneath a threadbare blanket in the corner of an old church shelter, her sketchbook unopened on her lap. Her thoughts were louder than the snores and coughing echoing through the room. Could she really do this? A child wasn't a product. It wasn't a transaction. But what choice did she have? She was alone, cold, hungry. The only thing she had left was her pride, and even that felt frayed at the edges. The thought of carrying a child, only to hand it over, haunted her. but so did the hunger in her bones. So did the nights spent praying her shoes wouldn't be stolen while she slept. By dawn, she still hadn't decided. But something in her had shifted. She whispered to herself, "If I'm going to do this, it has to mean something, even if no one else understands." 2 days later, Sophie signed the contract. No ceremony, no emotion, just ink on paper. Edward didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if a deal had been finalized. And in many ways it had. That afternoon, a black car came to pick her up. It was the cleanest, quietest ride she had ever experienced. Leather seats, bottled water, a driver who spoke only when necessary. She kept her eyes glued to the window, watching as her world transformed. The gray sidewalks gave way to tree-lined roads. The towering skyline faded behind gated communities and mansions carved into the hills. When they reached Edward's estate, she paused before stepping out. The gate alone was taller than anything she had ever owned. The house wasn't just large. It was intimidating. Grand in that way that whispered, "You don't belong here," without saying a word. Ivory stone, black iron accents, immaculate landscaping untouched by human hands. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the kind that comes from underfloor heating, not heart. A maid showed her to her room. It was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a bed the size of her old shelter's entire sleeping area, pillows so soft they felt like clouds, or lies. She didn't unpack. She wandered. Room to room, hall to hall. Every space was curated, polished, silent. No photographs, no clutter, no life. Eventually she found herself in the bathroom, a room larger than any apartment she'd known. It gleamed with marble and glass, a rainfall shower, a deep soaking tub. It was beautiful and unbearable. Sophie sat on the edge of the tub, fully clothed, her knees drawn to her chest, the silence pressed in. Not peaceful, hollow, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting to see if she would break. Her fingers trembled as she touched her stomach. She wasn't pregnant yet, but already the weight of what was coming felt impossible. She looked into the mirror, into eyes that had seen too much, too soon, and she whispered, "You're still Sophie. Don't forget that." The house didn't respond, but for the first time, she felt it watching her, not with cruelty, but curiosity, as if the mansion, like its master, was wondering what it had just let in. The first few days in the mansion were a slow suffocation for Sophie. She woke up early, ate alone, wandered the perfectly trimmed garden like walking through a painting. But Edward was never around. They lived under the same roof, yet inhabited two entirely separate worlds. One had entered this arrangement out of cold logic, the other out of survival, until one quiet winter morning. Returning from a routine prenatal appointment, Sophie found something unexpected resting on the small table near her bedroom window, a brand-new sketchbook with a soft leather cover. Beside it, several freshly sharpened pencils arranged neatly. No gift wrap, no elaborate note, just a single handwritten line on the first page. "I saw you drawing that night. Maybe. You need this more than I realized." No signature. But she knew. She stood there for a long moment, fingertips tracing the edge of the page. It wasn't the gift itself that struck her. It was the gesture. The quiet acknowledgement that for the first time since entering this house, someone saw her as a person, not a transaction. That night, Sophie cracked open the window, sat at the desk, and began sketching the garden below. Each pencil stroke deliberate, careful. Like every line helped her breathe again. A few days later, something else, something even more surprising happened. Edward knocked on her door, a rarity in itself. "I have an appointment with the doctor tomorrow," he said. "I'll come with you." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and left. Sophie sat still, caught off guard. Not by the offer, but by the awkwardness in his voice, the hesitation in his eyes, as if he wasn't quite sure why he had spoken at all. The next morning they sat together in the soft light of the ultrasound room. On the screen, a tiny figure moved gently, floating in the warmth of the womb. And then, thump, thump. The heartbeat filled the room, steady and alive. It echoed through the space like a forgotten melody. Sophie turned her head. Edward was frozen, hands clasped, eyes locked on the screen, and for just a moment, the coldness in his expression melted, replaced by something vulnerable. She looked away, but a quiet smile tugged at her lips. A heartbeat, a glance, a sketchbook. No grand declarations, but something had shifted, softly, almost imperceptibly, like sunlight creeping into a room long left in shadows. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time since signing that contract, Sophie felt maybe she was more than just the woman he hired to carry his child. The morning felt no different from the others, gray light pouring through the windows, the hum of the heater, the sound of footsteps on marble floors. But everything changed with a single sentence. Inside the soft-lit examination room, Sophie lay still, her hands gently resting on her belly. Edward sat beside her, silent, arms crossed, his posture stiff with emotional distance. The doctor adjusted the screen, furrowed his brow for a split second, then smiled. "There are 2 heartbeats." The room went quiet. Sophie blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. Edward leaned in. 2? His voice cracked slightly, betraying the calm he always wore like armor. "Yes," the doctor confirmed. "You're carrying twins." Time paused. Sophie's eyes welled up. Not with joy, not yet. With fear. Not one life. 2. 2 tiny beings growing inside her. 2 tiny hearts depending on her. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared for 1, let alone 2. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she thought she might faint. Edward said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, where 2 flickering heartbeats danced like distant stars. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Just a flicker of something soft, something unspoken. Awe, maybe. Or guilt. They drove home in silence. The kind of silence that's loud, filled with questions neither of them could form into words. That night, Sophie sat alone in the nursery-to-be. It was still just an empty room with bare walls, untouched furniture, and no warmth. She traced circles on her belly and whispered, "What am I going to do with both of you?" Downstairs, Edward stood in the hallway outside his study, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding a glass of untouched scotch. He had built empires, brokered billion-dollar deals, but tonight he felt helpless, and strangely, human. The days that followed weren't marked by grand gestures or emotional confessions, but by small, almost invisible changes. Edward no longer avoided eye contact. He began checking in, quietly, awkwardly. "Are you sleeping okay? Do you need anything?" Sometimes he'd linger longer at the doorway when she walked by, as if about to say something, but never quite did. Sophie noticed, and although she remained guarded, the sharpness in her gaze had softened. The line between them, once drawn so firmly by a contract, began to blur. They were still strangers in many ways, still cautious, but no longer untouched by each other's presence. And in the background, 2 tiny heartbeats continued to grow stronger, marking the rhythm of a bond that neither of them had expected. And neither of them could stop. Morning light spilled across the kitchen counters, casting soft golden lines on the polished marble. For the first time in weeks, Edward wasn't reading a financial report or answering emails. He was at the stove, awkwardly flipping pancakes, a task he hadn't attempted in over 2 decades. Sophie stood by the sink, barefoot, cradling a mug of tea. Her hair was loosely tied back, a soft cardigan draped over her shoulders. The scene could have passed for ordinary, a quiet breakfast between 2 people who shared a home. But it was more than that. They didn't speak much. Not at first, but silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like space. Space where something unspoken was beginning to grow. Over time, the smallest things began to shift. The way Edward started setting out 2 forks instead of 1. The way Sophie began leaving the lights on in rooms he used to keep dim. One evening, over roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, Edward spoke. Not with authority or pretense, but like a man trying to remember how to open his heart. "My first marriage ended with a lawyer's letter on a kitchen counter," he said, barely looking up. "Second one. Didn't even get that far." Sophie listened, not interrupting. Her eyes stayed on her plate, but her attention was wholly his. "I thought money could fill the silence." but all it did was echo louder. She nodded slowly, then said, "My mother died when I was 9. My dad didn't last much longer after that. Not emotionally, anyway." It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a simple truth. One she hadn't shared with anyone in years. They didn't cry. There were no long, comforting hugs, but something cracked open that night. Later, as Sophie passed the nursery, she paused and peeked inside. Edward was there, assembling a crib with a slightly crooked Allen wrench grip and a look of complete concentration. He hadn't asked for help, and she hadn't offered, but somehow it felt like they were building more than furniture. Some mornings they'd walk the garden path together. No holding hands, no declarations, just two quiet figures moving in step, watching the trees turn with the season. And when the babies kicked, both of them at once, Sophie grabbed Edward's hand, placing it over her belly without thinking. For a brief second his eyes widened, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something softer, like hope, or maybe belonging. There was no romance yet, no promises, but there was trust, tentative, fragile, and very real. And sometimes, trust is the first seed of love. The night came heavy with silence, thick, still, expectant. Rain tapped gently against the windows of the estate like a soft metronome marking the hours. Then, a sharp cry pierced through the quiet. Sophie was doubled over in pain, her face pale, her breath ragged. The contractions had come faster than expected. The hospital was 30 minutes away, but urgency left no room for hesitation. Edward had never driven that fast in his life. He didn't speak. He gripped the wheel tightly, eyes flickering to Sophie in the rearview mirror as she clutched her stomach. Her hand found his without looking, and for the first time he didn't freeze or pull away. He held it, firm, steady, like an anchor in a storm. In the delivery room, white walls, beeping monitors, rushing nurses. Edward stood at Sophie's side, eyes wide, hands trembling, but he never let go of hers. "You're doing great," he whispered, his voice barely holding together. "You're not alone. I'm here." For a man who built empires by controlling chaos, this moment stripped him bare. He couldn't fix this, couldn't delegate it. All he could do was be present. And then, it happened. The first cry echoed, a high, fragile sound, a heartbeat outside the womb. Seconds later, a second cry, softer, but just as alive. The doctor looked up. A boy and a girl. Edward stood frozen. His breath caught mid-chest. The world for just a second slowed to a hush. 2 tiny lives. 2 beginnings. The nurse handed him the first child, wrapped in a hospital blanket, impossibly small. His hands trembled as he held the newborn to his chest. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around the fabric of his shirt. Edward's eyes filled not with fear, not with confusion, but something deeper, raw, human. "I never thought," he said, his voice breaking, "I'd feel something this sacred." Sophie looked up from the bed, exhausted but glowing with a quiet strength. She saw him, not the man in a suit, not the one who offered a contract months ago, but someone entirely new. Someone discovering fatherhood not through biology or law, but through wonder. He sat beside her, holding both infants now, one in each arm. No music swelled, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet sound of breathing, and the shared understanding that everything had changed. Forever. The next morning the house was quieter than ever. Not the hush of peace, but the kind of silence that settles before a storm of goodbyes. Sophie stood by the window in the guest room, swaddling one of the twins with practiced care. Her eyes didn't leave the soft curve of the baby's cheek. She had done this every hour last night, fed, soothed, held, and now it was time to let go. The contract had been clear. Once the children were born, she would leave. No ties, no rights, no more mornings like this one. But paper didn't account for nights spent feeling those tiny kicks inside her, or the look Edward had given her in the delivery room, as if seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. Still, rules were rules. Promises were made, and Sophie had never broken her word. Downstairs, Edward sat in the living room, hands steepled beneath his chin. The baby's cries echoed faintly from above. He stared at the contract resting on the coffee table, untouched since the day they signed it. It felt cold now, soulless, like a relic from a different life. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow, hesitant. Sophie appeared, her coat folded over her arm, her bag slung over one shoulder. Her eyes didn't quite meet his. "I've packed my things," she said softly. "I'll call a cab." Edward stood, but he didn't move closer. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, that she didn't have to go, that maybe they could start over, not as a contract, but as a family. But fear had always been louder than hope for him, so instead he nodded, a small, tight nod that cracked something inside her. Sophie gave one last look toward the nursery, the room that still held her scent, her warmth, her tears, and turned toward the door. She didn't cry. Neither did he. But the silence that followed after the door closed behind her, it screamed. Edward stood alone in the hallway, fists clenched at his sides, and for the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. Upstairs, the twins stirred in their cribs. He heard them. Soft little sounds, like a question waiting for an answer. And that's when he knew Dot. Some choices can be reversed, Dot, but not all goodbyes have to be final. The air was cold that morning, but Sophie didn't shiver. She stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, a small duffel bag in her hand, heart heavier than the weight she carried. Just a few steps more, and she'd be gone. No one would stop her. That was the agreement. Behind her, the old iron gate creaked slightly in the breeze, like it, too, hesitated to let her leave. Then, his voice, quiet, but unmistakable. "Sophie." She turned. Edward stood on the porch, barefoot, disheveled, and above all, unmasked. The man who once measured life in profits and contracts now looked like someone who had just realized what he could lose. In his hand, the contract. Printed words, legal terms, a shield he'd once used to avoid feeling anything at all, and without a single word more he ripped it in half. Right there, under the soft gray sky. "I don't need this anymore," he said, his voice steady but his chest rising and falling fast. "I don't want a transaction. I don't want a goodbye. I want a family. One that includes you." Sophie didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat tightened and her eyes stung. She shook her head slightly, barely a whisper escaping her lips. "People always say that." Right before they walk away, Edward stepped down from the porch slowly. Each step felt deliberate, like he was crossing more than just physical distance. He was crossing years of silence, of detachment, of fear. "I'm not promising I won't make mistakes," he said, "but I will never walk away. Not from you. Not from them." He reached her, close enough now to see the tremble in her hands. "If you stay," he said softly, "I'll spend every day learning how to be someone who's worth being stayed for." Silence. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind paused, as if the world itself was waiting for her answer. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that someone finally saw her, wanted her not as a solution, not as an obligation, but as a person. A partner, a mother. She dropped her bag, not dramatically, just let it go, and with a quiet sob, she stepped into his arms. No music, no fireworks. Just two people, standing in the soft light of morning, choosing each other for the first time. Not out of need, but out of truth. The contract was gone, but something far stronger had been written that day, in silence, in vulnerability, and in the gentle way Edward whispered, "Let's go home." Sophie stayed. She didn't promise forever. She didn't say the words Edward longed to hear, but she stayed. And for Edward, that was more than enough. At first, their new life was clumsy. Two people who had spent most of their lives building walls now found themselves sharing breakfast trays, diaper duty, and awkward silences in the middle of the night. The mansion, once echoing with emptiness, now carried the soft symphony of bottles clinking, lullabies hummed half asleep, and the muffled cries of two newborns whose very existence had rewired the rhythm of this house. Edward, the man who once scheduled his life to the minute, now fumbled with baby wipes and formula bottles at 3 a.m. He wore spit-up on his cashmere. He forgot meetings. He got names wrong. And somehow, in that messy chaos, he smiled more than he ever had in boardrooms. Sophie, too, was learning, not just how to hold a baby the right way or how to swaddle without panic, but how to receive affection without suspicion. She had never seen a man try this hard. Not for her. Not for any woman, she thought. But Edward did. Every day, in the quietest ways. When she was too tired to cook, he ordered her favorite soup. When she fell asleep on the nursery floor, he carried her gently to the couch and draped a blanket over her. When the twins cried in the dead of night, he rose before her, whispering, "I've got them tonight." There were no grand declarations of love, no poetic confessions, just these small, almost invisible gestures that slowly stitched together something neither of them dared name yet. A family. And in the still moments, when both babies finally slept and the house sank into peace, Edward would glance across the room at Sophie, hair a mess, holding a lukewarm mug of tea, and think, This is what I never knew I needed. Sophie, catching that look, would smile. Not wide, not dramatic, just soft and honest. She still had fears. Still kept one hand near the door in her mind. But every time she looked at Edward cradling their children with a kind of awe, that door seemed a little further away. Love hadn't arrived like thunder. It had tiptoed in, through sleepless nights, spit up on sleeves, and shared silence. It wasn't perfect Dot, but it was real Dot, and it was theirs. It was a late Sunday afternoon, the kind where time felt slower, where sunlight slanted through the tall windows like warm gold, and everything in the world seemed calm. In the backyard garden, once manicured like a magazine spread but now speckled with toys and baby blankets, Edward sat cross-legged on the grass. His dress shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his once polished shoes forgotten on the porch. Sophie was nearby, under the shade of the old maple tree, painting lazily, her brush moving not for survival this time, but for peace. Their twins, now crawling, waddled unsteadily between them, chubby fingers reaching for blades of grass, giggling at the breeze. Then it happened. One of the babies, little Eli, turned to Edward, looked up with shining eyes, and babbled for the first time, "Dada!" Edward froze. A heartbeat passed. Then another. Sophie looked up, startled. Their eyes met, and for a moment the entire world stilled. Edward let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He smiled. Deeply. Quietly. Not the kind of smile that shone in boredom, but the kind that breaks you a little. The kind that says, "I've found home." Sophie stood and walked over, kneeling beside him. No words, just presence. Just the quiet thrum of something whole. Children, and whispered, This is the only thing I've ever built that I want to last forever." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Sometimes love doesn't. It just needs to be felt. Seen, chosen, again and again. And as the sun dipped below the garden wall, painting everything in soft amber light, the scene faded not with fireworks, but with the quiet laughter of a family. Unplanned, beautiful. Exactly the kind of ending life often gives us, if we're brave enough to choose it.